Following the partition of Babylon, immediately after the death of Alexander in mid-323 BCE, Perdiccas had achieved the preeminent position of regent to the as yet unborn child of Alexander and Roxanne, and Alexander's disabled half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus. While an agreement had been reached that if the as yet unborn child was a son, then he would be proclaimed king alongside Philip III. This was a decidedly shaky plan. There was no certainty that even if the child was male, that he would make it to adulthood. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the men gathered at Babylon were determined to fill this power vacuum. With the key leaders having been rewarded with the most lucrative satrapies, the Diadochi left Babylon. Almost immediately, negotiations and alliances formed, as they sought to position themselves for whatever was to come next. As it happened, it turned out to be the first war of the Diadochi. G'day and welcome back to the Research Project History. In this episode, we're taking a look at the First War of the Diadochi, the first of the major conflicts between Alexander's successors. But before we jump into it, please like and subscribe as it really helps the channel out. Thanks. It was during the Lamian War in 322 that Craterus finally reached Macedon. However, recognising the realities on the ground, he accepted that Antipater would remain in overall command in Macedon and the Greek homelands. This alliance was further cemented, with Antipater arranging for his daughter Philia to marry Craterus. With local politics sorted, Antipater then, in 321, sent another daughter, Nicaea, to Perdiccas, at the time in Sardis, a match that Perdiccas himself had requested back in 323. In the hope that a marriage alliance would cause Perdiccas to stop stirring up further Greek resentment to Antipater's Macedonian hegemony over the Greek homelands. However, things had changed since that request. When Perdiccas had requested the marriage alliance initially, it was likely to ally Antipater to Perdiccas and against Craterus, leaving the Macedonian Greek homelands under fractious rule. But this was no longer the case, with Craterus seemingly happy to be under Antipater's command and in a strong marriage alliance. Nicaea was no longer suitable for Perdiccas's purposes. Rejecting Nicaea and risking further degrading the relationship between Antipater and Perdiccas was the other marriage option that had arrived. Olympias, Alexander's mother, had sent her daughter and Alexander's sister to Perdiccas for similar purposes. Perdiccas no doubt saw it as a good thing that he could further align himself with Alexander's family at a time when their bloodline held dramatic sway over the army. While it was a straightforward choice for Perdiccas, it cemented in place a two-sided fracture in the empire. Meanwhile, Antigonus Monophthalmus, Antigonus the One-Eyed, rejected or at least gave up on his inheritance in Asia Minor in the short term, possibly because it was still needed to be conquered, and sided with Antipater and Craterus, leaving it to Perdiccas and the main or royal army to reconquer Paphlagonia and Cappadocia on behalf of Eumenes of Cardia. To this blossoming coalition was added Ptolemy, who, in assassinating Perdiccas's ally in Egypt, Cleomenes, who had been appointed as his second-in-command, as well as annexing the North African port city of Cyrene without seeking permission, had positioned himself as a firm anti-Perdican, a position that he had found himself in ever since the initial negotiations in Babylon, where he had argued against Perdiccas being regent, and rather a council of the Diadochi should rule the empire. However, in Egypt Ptolemy was isolated from the rest of the anti-Perdican faction, and would need to play his cards well. Perdiccas was in the position of most power, but a significant group had formed in tacit opposition to his dominance. With Perdiccas busy in Asia Minor, the general Aridaeus, not to be confused with Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, had been tasked with preparing Alexander's body for transportation and eventual interment. It had been said that Alexander's preference was to have his body laid to rest at the Siwa oasis in Egypt. This was a position Perdiccas had initially agreed to. However, for Ptolemy, arguably the most vocally anti-Perdican of the Diadochi, to have control of Alexander's body and resting place was a public relations situation that Perdiccas was unwilling to countenance. Moreover, if Perdiccas was to return to Macedonia with Alexander's body in its ornate carriage which had taken 2 years to build, along with the two kings, Alexander IV and Philip III Aridaeus, while married to Alexander's sister Cleopatra, and likely accompanied by Alexander's mother Olympia, would have been a propaganda coup that could well have quashed any questions to Perdiccas's authority in the eyes of the army, and be his best bet of easily overturning the control of Antipater and Craterus over Greece and Macedonia. With these factors in mind, Perdiccas decided that he would redirect the funeral procession from Egypt to Macedonia. In the spring or summer of 321, the general Herodias began transporting the body. Unbeknownst to Perdiccas, Ptolemy had also been in communication with the Herodias, and by prearrangement met him with an armed escort in Syria, and there was nothing the detachment sent from Perdiccas to recover the carriage was able to do to prevent Ptolemy returning to Egypt with a great trophy, which was then temporarily interred at Memphis. It is unknown why Herodias switched loyalty from Perdiccas to Ptolemy, but whatever the reasons, the loss of the body of the great king was an open affront to the notion that Perdiccas was in overall command of the Macedonian world, and would need to be dealt with for Perdiccas to retain any credibility. Making matters worse for the beleaguered regent, in the winter of 321-320, Antipater and Craterus, no doubt buoyed by Ptolemy's actions, offered him a formal alliance, while also deciding on military action against Perdican interests in Asia Minor. Ptolemy in Egypt seemed to be the greatest threat to Perdiccas. Consequently, he, along with the bulk of the royal army, departed from Asia Minor, along with the two kings, to campaign against Ptolemy in Egypt, leaving the Greek Eumenes in command of the defence of Asia from Antipater and Craterus in Macedon and Greece. Once Perdiccas had left the region, the expected confrontation began. Antipater and Craterus entered Asia and sent messages to Eumenes and other Macedonian general Neoptolemus. Eumenes was offered the retention of his satrapy, as well as other lands and bribes, if he were to break away from the Perdican faction. Eumenes refused, and made a counteroffer to reconcile Craterus with Perdiccas, and break him away from Antipater and Ptolemy. Neither side agreed to these proposals. In contrast, Neoptolemus was able to be persuaded, and chose to cast his lot in with the anti-Perdican alliance. He moved his forces in from the east towards the Hellespont, meeting up with Eumenes, pretending he was joining him to confront Antipater and Craterus. However, his betrayal was discovered, and the two sides formed in battle array. While Neoptolemus was able to defeat the infantry of Eumenes, Eumenes' cavalry were decisive, possibly making the most of a disarray caused by the collapse of the infantry, and handed Eumenes the victory. What was left of Neoptolemus' force quickly switched sides, swearing loyalty to Eumenes. Neoptolemus escaped with only 300 of his cavalry, and joined Antipater and Craterus. With open warfare now in full swing, it was decided that Craterus would lead the majority of their combined forces against Eumenes to secure Asia Minor as well as Macedon and Greece, while Antipater would take the remainder and go assist Ptolemy against Perdiccas in the southern battle arena of Egypt. Craterus entered the conflict with about 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. This was a similar size to that of Eumenes. However, Craterus's force was far more experienced. A further issue for Eumenes was that Craterus was extremely popular with the rank-and-file soldiers. This was such a potential problem that he did not reveal to his men the identity of who they were fighting against, claiming that they were fighting a reinforced Neoptolemus and another otherwise unknown general. Somewhere around eastern Phrygia, the two armies formed up against each other. Craterus took the right wing. Recognising this, Eumenes put his foreign cavalry up against that side, not wanting the Macedonians in his force to recognise the popular leader. To further prevent Craterus being recognised, Eumenes ordered that they attack immediately. This took Craterus by surprise, as Neoptolemus had advised him that Eumenes would be wary, and for Craterus to expect the Macedonian portion of Eumenes' army to desert and join him. The cavalry of both sides led at a distance from the infantry. Shockingly, in the first contact of the battle, Craterus was killed, greatly turning the situation in Eumenes' favour, with Craterus's cavalry quickly defeated. What remained of the cavalry quickly fled back to the infantry phalanx. Eumenes was once again successful, as his right infantry defeated that of Neoptolemus, with Neoptolemus also being killed in dramatic single combat with Eumenes. What was left of Craterus's army was rounded up by Eumenes cavalry and light-armed infantry in an open-air siege, and told that they would be prevented from foraging for food unless they switched sides and swore allegiance to Eumenes. This was a deal they seemed very willing to take up. However, once they had sworn allegiance and had sufficient time to gather food, they abandoned Eumenes and marched as quickly as they could after Antipater to join him in his efforts against Perdiccas. Meanwhile, having left Eumenes to defend his interests in Asia Minor, in the spring of 320, Perdiccas with the bulk of the royal army invaded Egypt. He would need to act quickly if he wanted easy success. He would have been hoping to have decisively dealt with Ptolemy long before help could arrive. But it would not be as simple as Perdiccas hoped. Ptolemy, it seems, had, in the 2 to 3 years since the settlement of Babylon, prepared for this eventuality. To his good fortune, he had inherited the control of 4,000 soldiers Alexander had stationed there, along with 30 triremes. To these he added 8,000 talents worth of mercenaries. Along with this, he had followed in Alexander's example, and taken on the trappings of an Egyptian ruler, and become the pharaoh, while also forging a close alliance with the priests, who were the real power brokers between the Egyptian public and the rulers. As such, he created a situation where the local elites were able to prosper and control the people, while the Macedonians were able to focus on their own ambitions. Arriving in Egypt, Perdiccas called an assembly of his troops, and had read to them the charges against Ptolemy. He was in no doubt trying to raise their enthusiasm for the campaign. However, Ptolemy was defended against them, and many of Perdiccas's men disagreed with the rationale for the campaign. However unenthusiastically, though, they began the campaign. Unfortunately, they were halted almost immediately, unable to cross the river at Pelusium on the Mediterranean coast. Perdiccas nonetheless lost significantly in this attempt, as a significant number of men deserted to Ptolemy, who was seen by some as the more competent commander. He then made an attempt further south to cross the river at a location called the Fort of Camels. Diodorus records the events this way. And as day was dawning, he began to send the army across, the elephants in the van, then following them the shield-bearers and the ladder-carriers, and others whom he expected to use in the attack on the fort. Last of all came the bravest of the cavalry, whom he planned to send against the troops of Ptolemy, if they happened to appear. When they were halfway over, Ptolemy and his troops did appear, coming at a run to the defence of the post. Although these got the start of the attackers, they threw themselves into the fort, and made their arrival known by the blasts of the trumpets and by shouts. The troops of Perdiccas were not frightened, but boldly assaulted the fortifications. At once the shield-bearers set up the scaling ladders and began to mount them, while the elephant-borne troops were tearing the palisades to pieces and throwing down the parapets. Ptolemy, however, who had the best soldiers near himself and wished to encourage the other commanders and friends to face the dangers, taking his long spear and posting himself on the top of the outwork, put out the eyes of the leading elephant, since he occupied a higher position, and wounded its Indian rider. Then, with utter contempt for the danger, striking and disabling those who were coming up the ladders, he sent them rolling down into the armour, into the river. Following his example, his friends fought boldly and made the beast next in line entirely useless by shooting down the Indian who was directing it. The battle for the wall lasted a long time, as the troops of Perdiccas, attacking in relays, bent every effort to take the stronghold by storm. While many heroic conflicts were occasioned by the personal prowess of Ptolemy, and by his exhortations to his friends to display both their loyalty and their courage, many men were killed on both sides. Such was the surpassing rivalry of the commanders, the soldiers of Ptolemy having the advantage of the higher ground, and those of Perdiccas being superior in number. Finally, when both sides had spent the whole day in the engagement, Perdiccas gave up the siege and went back to his own camp. Perdiccas wasn't done with just yet, though. Moving on down to Memphis, just south of the delta where the river divides, he attempted the crossing again, and Diodorus continues. Breaking camp at night, he marched secretly and came to the place that lies opposite Memphis, where it happens that the Nile is divided, and makes an island large enough to hold with safety a camp of a very large army. To this island he began to transfer his men, the soldiers crossing with difficulty because of the depth of the river, for the water, which came up to the chins of those who were crossing, buffeted their bodies, especially as they were impeded by their equipment. But Perdiccas, seeing the difficulty caused by the current, in an effort to break the downward rush of the river, placed the elephants in line on the left, thus mitigating the strength of the current, and placed on the right side the horsemen, through whose agency he kept catching men who were being carried away by the river, and bringing them safe to the other side. A peculiar and surprising thing took place during the crossing of the army, namely, that after the first men had crossed in safety, those who tried to cross after fell in great danger, for although there was no visible cause, the river became much deeper, and their bodies being totally submerged, they would one and all become completely helpless. When they sought the cause of this rise, the truth could not be found by reasoning. Some said that somewhere upstream a canal that had been closed had been opened, and joining with the river had made the ford deeper. Others said that rain falling in the regions above had increased the volume of the Nile. It was, however, neither of these things, but what happened was from the first crossing of the ford had been freer from danger, because the sand at the crossing had been undisturbed, but in the course of the other crossings by the horses and elephants, which had gone over and then by the infantry, the sand, trodden by their feet and set in motion by the current, was carried downstream, and the place of the crossing being hollowed out in this way, the ford became deeper in the middle of the river. Since the rest of his army was unable to cross the river for this reason, Perdiccas was in great difficulty, and as those who had crossed were not strong enough to fight the enemy, and those on the near bank were not able to get to the aid of their fellows, he ordered all to come back again. When all were thus forced to cross the stream, those who knew how to swim well and were strongest of body succeeded in swimming across the Nile with great distress, after throwing away a good deal of their equipment. But of the rest, because of their lack of skill, some were swallowed by the river, and others were cast upon the shore towards the enemy. But most of them, carried along for some time, were devoured by the animals in the river. Perdiccas lost over 2,000 men in this debacle, and his position in the eyes of his men plummeted from its already relatively low position. And to emphasise this point, Ptolemy held a funeral for the bodies from his side of the river, and had the cremated remains returned to their friends and families. It seems Perdiccas may have left his invasion too late in the year, with the annual flooding of the Nile already in effect, leaving him unable to inflict significant harm to the Egyptian satrap. Perdiccas was now in a precarious position, with opposition forces in Europe and Egypt in solid defensive positions against him. To make matters worse, around 100 of his officers came to the conclusion that their interests were best served without Perdiccas, and despite him offering them gifts and rewards, they murdered him, either in his tent if you go by Diodorus, or during a minor cavalry skirmish according to Arrian. Notable among the assassins were Siculus, Pythion, and Antigones. Either way, the fumbling of their campaign had cost Perdiccas everything. The day after Perdiccas's murder, Ptolemy was welcomed into the formerly Perdican camp, where he was met with the late regent's assassins, who were quickly pardoned, while Ptolemy provided gifts to the two kings. The remaining Perdican forces swore allegiance to Ptolemy, and to the two kings who were in need of a new regent. Although pressured, Ptolemy decided against taking up the regency, seemingly recognising it for the poisoned chalice that it was. Instead, Triparadeisos, the one who had colluded with Ptolemy to take Alexander's body, and Pythion, one of the key conspirators against Perdiccas, were appointed to the regency. The following day, Ptolemy addressed the soldiers, and assured them that he would look after and provide all they needed, and to allay their fears regarding their dwindling supplies. Ptolemy was enthusiastically greeted by the soldiers, who pressured him to take the regency, but once again he decided against it. At around this time, apparently during Ptolemy's meeting with the soldiers, news reached Egypt of the death of the popular Craterus. In response to this, the soldiers now demanded that all those associated with Perdiccas be sentenced to death, whether present or absent. This included many powerful people. Perdiccas's sister, Atalante, who was married to Attalus, was killed, while Eumenes, Alcibiades, and Attalus were condemned in absentia. Less than 3 full years had passed since the death of Alexander, and his all-conquering army had turned on itself, leaving the 2 most powerful generals dead. The petition of Babylon had failed. New arrangements were needed. Ptolemy and the combined army, along with the 2 kings and their new regents, left Egypt in August or September 320 and reached Triparadeisos in northern Syria. Here, simmering tensions in the ranks, mainly over late or missing payments, broke out. Eurydice, wife of King Philip III Herodias, was at the centre of the tensions, positioning herself as the champion of the soldiers' cause, likely to try and gain more power and influence than she was able to get given her disabled husband. Although officially the king, he was in reality a mere talisman of the Argead dynasty. In response to the soldiers' uprising, Herodias and Pythion gave up the regency in favour of Antipater, who had not yet arrived, and let him deal with the mess. With Antipater's arrival, tensions again broke through, with Antipater nearly being killed, only being saved by Antigonus Monophthalmus and Seleucus, with Antigonus calming the soldiers by reassuring them that their pay would be coming shortly. With the recent internal fighting and switching of allegiances, the mercenary nature of the armies was becoming increasingly important, as the soldiers were less confident in the leadership and more careful to guard their own personal interests. Once the rioting had been quelled, an assembly of the army was called for, where Antipater's regency was agreed to. The new regent, along with the others of the Diadochi, negotiated a redistribution of the satrapies and army commands. For those gathered at Triparadeisos, the important issue to deal with was the defeat of what remained of the former pro-Perdican alliance, most significantly Eumenes. Antigonus Monophthalmus was appointed to lead the campaign against Eumenes, and was given command of the royal army, as well as guardianship over the 2 kings. While Antigonus was the most significant promotion after Antipater, it seems Antipater did not fully trust him, and appointed his own son to be Antigonus's chilarch, or second in command, to keep an eye on him. The other significant winner at Triparadeisos was Seleucus, who, rewarded for helping to save Antipater's life, was appointed as satrap of Babylon. Meanwhile, Eumenes, who had not been present at the negotiations, was shoring up his own position in Asia. Upon hearing the news of Perdiccas's death, he informed his troops that Perdiccas had been unjustly murdered, and the 2 kings were now captives of a rebellious army, and that he, Eumenes, was the true loyalist to Alexander's heirs, while also granting permission for those who wanted to leave his service to do so. These moves ensured that the troops he had would be as loyal as he could hope for given the circumstances. And he didn't solely rely on his claim to legitimacy to keep the soldiers loyal. He also got them paid, by marching them to the Hellespont and forcing the local population to pay them. He then went on to raid areas loyal to the opposing alliance to boost their pay further. This plan worked, and he forged a loyal force who began to be the envy of the opposing armies, who were still struggling with pay issues. Antipater returned to Macedon in the winter of 320-319. An old man, regent of a vast but shaken empire, with significant portions in open rebellion against him. The divisions in the empire were now setting in, but it hadn't fallen apart completely just yet. Everything was far from settled. But the First War was over with. This has been the First War of the Diadochi. Key references for the research done in this are in the description below. Thanks for joining me. Please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.